Hi guys, Mr. Davis here. Hope you're well. And this is the final lesson on the section B topic that we've been looking at to do with information processing. So it follows on from our work on the information processing model, the work in memory, and then more recently schema theory. And this one is all going to be about response time. So before we get into that, a series of knowledge recall questions for you to work through. I won't read out the questions now, but just pause the video. Make sure you've got an answer written down for each of the 6 questions, and then we'll pick it up again shortly. Okay, so we'll do these one at a time. As always, just purple pen your answers, tick it if you think your answer is reflective of the information that I put up on the presentation, and obviously pause it and write in the corrections if you've got something different. Okay, so here we go. The first question, 2 parameters which are part of a recognition schema. So you get a mark for each one. And those are the sensory consequences and the response outcome. So you can remember sensory consequences, that's all to do with information about the feel of the movement, so things like grip and the weight of the pass, things like that. And then the response outcome, that's to do with the feedback, so feedback about the result. Second question, which parameter of schema would judging whether to pass or shoot be from? Judging whether to pass or shoot. And that would be response specifications. And again, what do you think that is to do with? So response specifications, that's information about what you actually do. So you're assessing your available options and then deciding what the actual appropriate response is. Number 3, which part of the schema deals with information about the feel of the movement? As we just said, that is sensory consequences of things like the grip, the weight of the pass, as we said before. Number 4, what's the name given to the technique of breaking a skilled action into parts or subroutines? That is chunking. Hopefully you remember that chunking, breaking a skill down into smaller parts or subroutines, making it slightly easier to learn, particularly if it's a complex skill. Number 5, which part of the working memory system coordinates information into integrated sequences? That is episodic buffer. It's an episodic buffer, so it takes in that information and produces these organized sequences where it coordinates the information from the phonological loop, and the visuospatial sketchpad puts it into some sort of organized time frame, which it can then be sent to the long-term memory for a comparison to see what it's already got up there. Number 6, which are the 2 parts of the phonological loop? So if you remember, it's split into 2, or there's 2 parts of it. You've got the phonological store and the articulatory system. Bonus points for remembering what each of those does, or even just their kind of more common name, if you like. So the phonological store, otherwise known as the inner ear, and that's kind of linked to speech perception, and it just holds that information that you're taking in just for maybe a second or 2. And then the articulatory system is what's commonly known as the inner voice, and that's linked to speech production. So you kind of use that system to rehearse and store the information that's been initially held by the phonological loop. So for instance, if someone tells you a phone number and you just play it back in your head, or even just their name, you go, oh yeah, nice to meet you, so and so. That's just that production of how that works there. It's just that part of your memory system. Okay, so as I said, purple pen, anything there that's it's not quite right, and if you've got a lot wrong in a particular topic area there, please make sure that you just pause the video here, take some time just to go back over that topic and make sure there's no big gaps there moving forward. Otherwise, we are good to go. So as I said, today's lesson, and this one actually I think we might stretch out over a couple of lessons because there's quite a lot of content here. I'll leave you to decide how far you get through in the first day's work, and then this next day finish it off maybe, and I'll add in some additional questions for the following lesson. But here we go, response time then. Learn an objective to learn how responses in sport occur and how this process can be improved. To learn how responses in sport occur and how this process can be improved. And then some keywords there, each one of which we'll go into in a lot more detail, but just note them down now. So we've got Hicks law, psychological refractory period, otherwise known as PRP, a lot easier to say than psychological refractory period, and anticipation, something that you've probably got some familiarity with, but we need to now make it into a concept that we've got a real good understanding of how it works. So make sure that information is nice and clear on your page before we move on. Underline title and date, and then when it's sent to me, I know exactly what day and what topic it is that you are sending me. Okay, here we go. So before we kind of get into the meat of it, it's really important that you've got an understanding of some specific definitions that we're going to be using quite frequently throughout this presentation. So those are the three things. You may have seen them before. You may even have an idea of what one or two of them might mean. So in simple terms, just to kind of get the ball rolling, I've noted them down into very simplistic definition. Can you match those simple definitions to the key term? So let's go through them. So these wouldn't be the definitions you put down in the exam, but just help shape your understanding of what they mean. So the reaction time is the bit before the actual movement. Now you might have a definition of reaction time that you already know about, excuse me, from GCSE PE. So that kind of just helps shape that idea, but it's the bit before you actually move in the whole process. Movement time, clues in the name, that's the time or the bit during the actual movement. So it doesn't include the first bit. It's just about the actual point from movement to the end of the movement. And then finally, response time is the full sequence of responding to it and then the time taken to produce the movement. So now let's just take that up a notch and make sure we've got, quality definitions. Again, these aren't in order. Just take a minute to pause the video and just try and work out which one applies to each one of those key terms. And we'll go through them. So reaction time. So you might have something similar in your head from GCSE PE. Time taken from the onset of the stimulus to the onset of the action, or the start of the action. So it's when you first get that stimulus, whatever that stimulus might be, to the onset or the very start of the action, but it doesn't include any period of movement. It's just taking on the stimulus. Movement time is just the time taken to complete the task or the time taken to produce the movement for the skill or the event that's being participated in. And then you've probably worked out already that response time is the time taken from the onset of the stimulus, so the very beginning of this process, to the completion of the task. So essentially, response time is reaction time plus movement time. Just take a moment just to go over that and make sure you're clear. Reaction time is the initial part of the process where you're taking on board the stimulus. Movement time is the time taken to actually produce the movement. And then response time is the combination of those two things together. For the purpose of this, the terms reaction time and response time are actually used kind of interchangeably, but you might get a smaller question which asks you for a definition. So it's important that you're clear on that. But for the purpose of a lot of this, whether you refer to it as reaction time or response time, if you improve your reaction time, you're going to improve your response time as a result. So just be clear on that before we move on. Right, now to put it into some sort of context. So the most obvious example where reaction time in sport is important might be something like the 100 meters, and particularly the start of the 100 meters. Okay, now where do you think each of these key terms would actually apply during the 100 meters event? So reaction time, where does that kind of over this period here to the end of the event? Where's reaction time happening? Well, hopefully you're thinking from here to here is reaction time. So let's call that A. A is reaction time from the stimulus, which is the sound of the gun, to the initial period of just taking on board that stimulus, but without actually doing anything, so that you obviously don't move until you're coming forward from the blocks. So it's from here up until the blocks. Movement time is then from the blocks to the end of the race, or the tape, or essentially the 100 meters run. So you've got reaction time here up to the blocks. You've then got from the blocks to the finish line is movement time and response time is the whole thing together. So just take a moment to pause the video and just try and detail that down, just like nice and brief, what's happening in terms of point A, point B, and point C in the 100 meters race, and obviously make reference to reaction time, movement time, and response time. Hopefully you've got something along the lines of this. So with my squiggle over the top. So reaction time is the period from here in the gun until you're just about to move. Movement time is the time between pushing against the block, so that very initial part of the movement to then the end of the race. And then response time is the time between here in the gun and hitting the tape. Now, it might be that some people refer to movement time as in the kind of the end of the start. But if we're going from the information from the book, which would make sense because that's linked into the exam, we'll just go through to the end of the event in this case. Okay, so what I now need you to do is think about that same process, using your understanding of those terms, describe the skill of catching a ball hit by the batter in cricket. So break that down into essentially A, B, and C, but reaction time, movement time, and response time. Just one statement for each one in terms of catching a ball in cricket. Pause the video here and just try and complete that for me. And you should have something along the lines of reaction time is picking up the flight of the ball as it leaves the bat until just before the movement going towards the ball. So you're being clear about what the point in time where the stimulus appears, and then gives some kind of clarity about what's that leading up to. So you're picking up the flight of the ball, that's the stimulus as it leaves the bat, until just before the first movement. To a certain extent, that's a generic phrase in terms of reaction time, because you could use that for anyone, just until before the start of that movement. Then movement time is from actually making that first step towards the ball, so the initial part of the movement, up until catching the ball, so essentially the end of it. So again, it's just giving it a time frame from this to this. And then response time is just a kind of combination. So from picking up the stimulus, the flight of the ball, which was the first bit here, to the actual catch, which is the final bit here. So hopefully you can see that's from there to there, which is response time. Okay, you could go through various other examples. You don't necessarily have to write them down, but just have a think. Maybe to do with like a racket sport or something like that, and think about how those three things would be broken down, just so you've got a clear idea of it. And then we will move on. So one thing to be clear on is that there's actually different types of reaction time, and you need to make a note of these. So you've got simple reaction time and choice reaction time. And again, to a certain extent, the clue's in the name. So if you just take a minute just to think, don't have to write anything down at this stage, just think what might be the difference between those two based on the name. Which one might be a quicker reaction time? Why might that be a quicker reaction time? So what I want you to think about, what do you think the difference between the two is? Which one do you think produces a faster reaction? Why might that be? And can you think of sporting examples of each one? So before we move on, just take a moment just to try and challenge yourself to think this through without just kind of going to the answer. Pause the video, just try and note down an answer for each of those things before we move on. Okay, so let's just go through it then. So simple reaction time, we'll do these one at a time. Key thing with this is it's one specific response to one stimulus. One specific response to one stimulus. As a result, it's a much faster reaction time. For instance, an athlete in the 100 meters reacting to the gun, so that the gun is one single response. It's not like they're looking at anything else or waiting for any other kind of stimulus to occur. They're just waiting for the sound of the gun and their only reaction to that will be to, get up out of the blocks and sprint as fast as they can forward. So it's just one stimulus and one response. That makes that whole process a very smooth and quick process of reaction and response. So one choice, it's a fast reaction, and the response is the athlete only has to think about one thing and one way of reacting. So you've got a classic example there. To be honest, you don't need a range of examples for this, but if you did need another one, again, just the start of a race is the most obvious one. You're not going to get asked for a range of different examples. You might get asked for one, and that is the one to go with. So the start of 100 meters or the start of the swimming race, where again, it's just the kind of the sound of the gun going off. So just make sure you've got those noted down. Next one's a little bit more complicated. So choice reaction time, clues in the name. So multiple stimuli to choose from. So it's not just one stimulus like the sound of the gun. Potentially lots of different stimulus that you've got to choose from. Straight away, that complicates the process. As a result, the response time is much slower. So if you've got to consider multiple different pieces of information, sensory information coming in, being processed, that's going to slow the process down. You've got to think about different things. You can also base it on the idea that there might be a number of different responses. So it's likely that in addition to there being multiple stimuli coming in, there's also multiple potential responses. So you've got different options and different things to think about once you've actually taken on board the stimulus like there, and you've chosen what the correct stimulus is to focus on. So for example, a midfielder is having to choose the correct stimulus from various different things coming towards them on the pitch, whether that's things auditory, so things that they can hear, things that they can see, things that they may be able to sense, that balance and kinesthesis and all of that sort of thing. All of that information's coming in, and it's not like they've just got one set response they've got to go to. Even in simple terms, it might just be pass, shoot, dribble, same sort of thing in basketball. You've got a lot to process there. So in addition to all of the stimulus coming in, you've then got different options to choose from. So as is my explanation of this, slightly longer and more complex, that's true to fact in terms of how choice reaction time works. So essentially more choices, so it's a slower response time. Now, can you think of any examples? I've given one here, but can you think of others? So for instance, can you think of ones, the kind of the go-to different activities here? So we've said about like 100 meters, so an athletics-based one, but that would be for simple reaction time. But the other examples that we really want to be thinking about are in a games-based, like an invasion games sport, like football, basketball, rugby, hockey, netball, that sort of thing. But then you've also got racket sports. So think of maybe an example from a racket sport. And you've also got like bat and ball games, so cricket, rounders, and things like that. Okay, so in terms of your other examples, those are the kind of activity areas that you want to be thinking of. So pick out at least one from those options. Like I said, probably best to think of a racket sport or a bat and ball sport. An instance where choice reaction time might be occur in there, and explain why. Why is that choice reaction time in your example? Okay, now a few bits of theory that you've also got to be aware of. So there's various different factors that influence response time. You might be able to just take a moment to think about that. What sorts of things are, we've already mentioned a couple just from the last slide, but what other things might influence response time? One of the crucial ones that we've got to be aware of is the number of choices. So that's kind of linked into choice reaction time. Very much linked into it. And the theory that's known as is Hicks' law. So if you make a note of that, and we'll just go through what Hicks' law is all about. Essentially, its reaction time increases as the number of choices increase. So essentially, as I said right at the start, anything to do with reaction time increasing will also mean response time is increasing, because the two go hand in hand. So if reaction time increases, response time will increase. If the number of choices increases, reaction time will increase. Just like we explained before, more things to think about, more stimuli coming in, more potential responses as a result, that's going to increase reaction time and essentially increase your response time. So this can be manipulated and used to a player's advantage. So, for example, in tennis, if the server is able to use a great deal of variety on their serve, so it's not just getting the ball in, so at a higher level, they can adjust the spin, they can change the speed, they can vary the direction, amongst other things in terms of the serve. That's going to keep the opponent guessing. And if they're guessing, they've got more choices. And if there's more choices, it's going to mean that their reaction time has increased. So it's a slower response. So the variety will increase response preparation time and delay the actions. That's just a fancy way of saying they've got more to think about before they actually make a decision and process what it is that they're going to do. So as a result, everything is delayed. If the first part of it is slowed down, everything else is then going to be delayed as well. Can you think of other examples in sport where Hicks' law can be applied? So where in other sporting examples is there a wide variety of options that are presented to a performer, and in those cases, when is that going to delay reaction time? So again, in this case, I've given the example of tennis. But can you think of one maybe from an invasion game like football or rugby or basketball? Or can you think of one from a bat and ball game like cricket? So pause the video here. Try and just give a simple example like the one I've done here. It doesn't have to be long. Just a basic outline of what is it, what's going on in that particular example. What is the variety that you're talking about that's going to lead the opponent to be considering more options than they would if it was just simple reaction time. So yeah, pause the video here and just try and complete that for me. Okay, right. Now, in addition to just the actual general line, there's a graph here that you've got to be familiar with. Now, I've shown two versions of this. One of these is accurate and one of them is not. So I want you to have a think about it. Take a look at the bottom here. So what are we actually considering? So it's choices and time. And essentially, they're both saying that as the number of choices increases, the time that it takes to make the decision or to respond is going to go up. But there's a slight difference in the two graphs here. So which of these do you think best represents the relationship between the available choices and the reaction time? So they're similar up to a point, but then this one plateaus out here and this one continues to go up. Which one do you think is accurate and why? You don't have to write an answer down, but just take a moment to think about it. Okay, so hopefully you've got with this one. So this is the one that's accurate. And I'll explain why now. So what I want you, well, let's go through, I think that's come up early. So let's go through this first. So it's not a straightforward linear relationship. So it doesn't just, as this goes up, this goes up. It doesn't just fly up like that. And there's a reason why. That's why we're saying it's not linear. It doesn't just go straight up. So reaction time does not increase at the same rate as the choices increase. So as a basic rule, the number of choices as the number of choices increase, the time that it takes to make the decision or to respond increases as a basic rule. However, a bit like when we're talking about arousal and that inverted U goes up and then down again, so up to a point, and this is kind of up to a point here, and then it starts to plateau. So why might it start to plateau? So one of the reasons is as players get more familiar with their environment and what's going on within the context of the game, the rate that the reaction time increases starts to level off. It's still increasing up to this point, but maybe not as quick as it was right at the start. So it's starting to plateau, and then up to kind of once it gets to this stage, it's almost leveling off. And part of the reason for that is that players get more familiar with them. So just to put that into context, so for instance, in tennis, as the game goes on, if you're playing like a professional playing a long game, after the third, maybe the fourth, and into the fifth set, so we're talking maybe 2, 3, 4 hours of tennis, they're going to get more used to the type of shots that are coming their way. So in terms of a service return, yeah, at the start it might have presented some challenge where you don't know where the serve's coming. 3 hours later, you might have got used to that now. You can maybe read it a little bit and pick up some of the little cues that you're looking at from the opponent. That makes it easier to read to a certain extent, and we're going to touch on this shortly. You start to anticipate what's coming. You've grown experienced even within the time period of the event. Your experience of it over just 2 or 3 hours might have meant that you can not always, but you can start to pick up with some level of success what might be coming. You can read it a little bit more. So as a result of that, their response becomes slightly quicker. So that's one of the reasons. The familiarity of the environment and the experience picked up just means that reaction time starts to improve. The other more straightforward reason is that it starts to plateau because at some point, ultimately, they have to make a decision. It can't just be that more and more choices are being presented. So the time just ticks on and on and on and on and on. If you're in the middle of a football game, at some point, you've got to make a decision. If you don't make a decision, you're just going to give the ball away. So, same thing with returning a serve. At some point, you've got to try and make a decision. Otherwise, the ball's just gone past you. You have to ultimately, whether it's successful or not, you have to commit and try and make a decision. So that's one of the more straightforward reasons why it starts to plateau, because time can't just continue to go on and on and on until a decision's been made. That's almost taken out of your hands. So two key things to bear in mind there. Okay, so it's not a straight. The general rule is that as the number of choices increase, the time taken to respond will increase. However, it starts to plateau because one, players become more familiar with the environment, and the experience of it starts to influence the success that they might be having. They can start to anticipate and read what might be coming, but also there might be a plateau because the player ultimately just has to make a decision, because time isn't just going to allow them to go on and on and on thinking about it. So can you think of any sporting examples where response time may become slightly quicker as they get used to the potential choices? So thinking about this one. So I've given an example from tennis. So again, maybe think invasion games or think bat and ball games. Just a brief outline, why might response time improve as a result of that experience within the game? Just pause the video here. Once you've got this information noted down, just add in your own example or two, just to make sure that you're clear on that. Okay, so just to give that some sort of context, this isn't a sporting example, but it does just kind of help drum home the point. Whether you've got a pack of cards and a stopwatch, by all means, you can complete this task. It won't take too long. Otherwise, just run through the process, and even if you haven't got the cards, it's pretty clear what this is to do with. So if you were to record the time taken for each of these processes, so each time you start with the cards face down, all of them. So get them all out, spread them all out over the table, face down. First task, time how long it takes to turn them all over one at a time until they're all 52 cards are turned over. Each time, that's just one choice. Pick up a card, turn it over, pick up a card, turn it over. That's a simple reaction time. So as we said before, those are the quickest ones. So it's likely that that's going to be reasonably quick. If you did that process again, but this time, once you've turned them all over, divide them into red and black. So now instead of just one choice, you've now got two choices going on. Third time, turn them all over, one at a time. This time you're dividing them into piles of each suit. So you've got clubs, you've got hearts, you've got diamonds and spades. 4 choices. So how long is that going to take? And then the final one, from all the cards being face down, you turn them over one at a time and you divide them into piles of numbers and pictures in each suit. So when you've got the diamonds, all the pictured cards of the diamonds in one pile and all the number cards of the diamonds in another pile, and you do that for each of the suits, that's going to be 8 different choices. So you go from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8. And if you timed yourself for each one, and then you actually recorded that on a graph, so let's, for example, here, let's say this was 1. Let's say this is 2. Let's say this is 4. And let's say this is 8. On the first one, that's going to be the time. And let's say that is, I don't know, 20 seconds. Here, that might be, let's call it 40 for the sake of this. Here, it's going to have gone up a little bit more. So let's say that's 50. And here, say that's 60. So the actual biggest increase is this one here. And then it starts to level off. And from here, there's not actually that big a difference between 4 and 8. There's quite a lot of decisions to be made here. Yeah, there's a few more going on here, but you've already got to that point where the number of decisions ultimately isn't going to affect the time taken. So once you've drawn your graph and added those things in, that's the process that you've got to understand. Now, you wouldn't use that example in an exam, but it just highlights the idea that the number of choices isn't going to mean that there's a continual increase in time. It starts to tail off, it starts to level off here and plateau. And the reason for that is the difference between the number of choices at the top end isn't going to have such a huge impact on the time. Okay, next one. Single channel hypothesis. Now, this is actually a lot simpler than it sounds, so don't be afraid of this one. The key thing here is that stimulus can only be processed one at a time. One single stimulus can be processed at any one time. Any others, second one, third one, fourth one, they have to wait in line until the first one or the one previous to that one has been processed. So if this is the first stimulus coming in here, and this is the point where it's going to be processed here, you can't fit the other one in. It's only allowing one at a time. That one has to wait until this one has been processed. Now, this is linked in to support Hicks' law, where the more choices means a slower response. If you've only got one stimulus, then you're only waiting, the time that it's going to take is for this one stimulus to come through and be processed. If you've got more than one stimuli, then you've got to wait for that one to be processed, and then after that one's been processed, you've got to wait for the second one. So there's a delay in the process of the second one because you've got to wait for the first one to be processed. This essentially is known, and this is a phrase that you could use, it's used sometimes in the exam, it's known as a bottleneck effect. The bottleneck effect. It's a similar sort of process without going off on too much of a tangent, but in terms of like cars on a road. So if you've got a junction, cars coming from two different roads and coming into one, you can't both come in here at the same time, they'll just get jammed. So it ends up being, you know, one at a time, one from this side, then one from this side, then another one from this side, then another one from this side, one at a time. And this road ends up being really busy because it's a bottleneck effect. And there's a kind of backlog of cars coming back here. You get the idea. Okay, so what I want you to do here is just make a note of the description, obviously note down the subheading, and then just draw the diagram. I know I've made a bit of a mess of this one, but essentially that's what you want. Stimulus 1 coming in, stimulus 2 having to wait. Just to explain that that's sometimes known as the bottleneck effect, where more choices means a slower response. So pause the video and just make sure you've got that down. Closely linked to that is something called the psychological refractory period. So this is a delay where the second stimulus presented before the first one has been processed. So if you just knock back here, so before this one's actually got to this point and been processed, this one has actually come along to the party a little bit too early, and that causes a delay. Okay, sometimes in sport you hear this phrase about players freezing in momentarily, where they're just trying to work out sort of conflicting information. Same sort of analogy where, you know, like a rabbit stuck in headlights in the road. Same sort of principle. You just don't know what to do. Obviously, it's not a great idea just to stand there and do nothing. Just in that split second, you don't know what to do. You're just frozen in time. The best example and the most common example of this in terms of exam questions is a net cord, whether it's a net cord in tennis or a net cord in badminton. And most of the ones that I've seen are from a tennis example. So players are obviously having a rally and the ball's flying over the net, but it's not uncommon, particularly at an elite level, where there's not a huge margin for error, that they hit the ball over the net. It sometimes can clip the net on the way over. Now on a serve, you just take it again, assuming that the ball's gone in, and you just repeat the serve. But in a rally, play just continues, and the other player has to respond to the net cord. So in that case, it might be that hitting the net cord actually makes the ball deviate from its original path. So maybe initially was going off to the right, to a right-hander's forehand, but the ball clips the net on the way over and it ends up kind of changing its line a little bit and coming towards the backhand side, so towards a right-hander's left-hand side. So instead of going to their forehand, the ball goes over to their backhand. And in terms of the process, the thought process involved, before, you can't just, all right, it's onto my backhand and then immediately change. There's a little bit of a process here. So before you adjust to sort out the new one, i.e. it's coming onto my backhand, you need to disregard the previous one, which is now useless. So you've still got to try and see through that process of, it's coming onto my forehand, I'm going to hit a forehand. But then before that actually happens, the ball clips the net and it starts coming onto your backhand. So you've got to suddenly think, forget the forehand, now I'm going to hit a backhand. That adjustment causes a delay. And the delay is the psychological refractory period. So there's a delay in the thought process because you still have to deal with the original stimulus of the ball coming one way before then saying, it's coming the other way, I need to play a backhand. So you can't say, now I play a backhand. You have to say, I was going to play a forehand, now I'm going to play a backhand. And that slows it down. It slows down the process. That delay is the PRP, the psychological refractory period. Because of that delay, the overall issue is that there's a slower response. And more often than not, when the ball clips the net like that, players really struggle to actually then pick up the ball. And often that's the end of the point. At an elite level, depending on how severe the net cord was, they might be able to produce something. But it's going to be a very difficult shot. More often than not, it's going to be a weak shot, or they're going to make an error off that shot because they're rushed. The reaction time is slower, so they have to rush the movement time, and as a result, they'll miss the shot. The psychological refractory period. So just make sure that that's clearly written down. Make sure that you work through this example in your notes, because this is the most common example that's used in sport, but there are others. So what I want you to do, in addition to that tennis example, which has just been worked through, explain how the PRP can be applied in relation to, and I've just given you the examples here, a wicketkeeper in cricket, in what situation might a wicketkeeper have to what's the word? Use that kind of psychological refractory. When might that occur in terms of a cricket wicketkeeper, and when might that occur in terms of a goalkeeper in football? So that delay in process where they think, I'm going to go this way because this way is where the ball's going. Oh no, the ball's gone that way. Just try and work through the examples of each of those. It doesn't have to be massively detailed. Flip back onto the previous slide if you need to, just to see it, the wording of it, and just be clear at the end what the result is of that and how might that impact on their performance. Let's just pause the video there and work through those two examples for me. Okay, and this just gives it a little bit of a kind of image to go with. So it's the delay in the second stimulus presented before the first one's been processed. So before that first one has been processed, the second stimulus has been presented. In sport, this is seen from a player freezing. So stimulus 1, so it's the ball's been hit and it's coming towards the forehand. That would match up with response 1. So the player is then going to actually move and try and play their forehand. But before it gets to that stage, stimulus 2, where the ball's hit the net and it's clipped the net, changed the path of the flight of the ball. That's then linked to response 2 over here. But before you can actually process this one, you've got to deal with this one, stimulus 1. And it's this delay here, whilst you're dealing with that initial stimulus that was linked to that, this period of delay, the psychological refractory period, you've got to just process that before then the second stimulus can be processed in order to produce your second response. Okay, sounds complicated. The key thing is you have to deal with the first stimulus before you can process the second one. And that delay in processing the first one is known as the psychological refractory period. Might be worth just noting that diagram down and just annotating around it just so it's clear. This bit here, this period of delay between the first stimulus being processed and the second stimulus being processed, that delayed period there is the psychological refractory period. Okay, now as I mentioned previously, anticipation, probably something that we're relatively familiar with as a general term, but how can we apply it here? So essentially a short definition is just prejudging a stimulus. So guessing, second guessing, however you want to phrase it, but prejudging a stimulus. So for example, a performer tries to work out what's going to happen before it actually happens. You anticipate something. So before the event, you're essentially making a guess, an educated guess, however you want to call it, but you are trying to produce an action before you know what's actually going to happen. So this can be done using information from the environment. So it's not just a wild guess. I mean, at a lower level, it could be, but then it's not so much anticipation. Then you're generally just guessing there. But if it's as you get better at it, anticipation can be essentially, it's almost like a skill. It can be done well. If you've got good anticipation, you're able to do this fairly successfully. It can be done using information from the environment, such as the cues from the opponent, whether it's body language, positioning, subroutines that you're able to pick up from on the shot. So I'm thinking from my tennis days, I used to be able to just pick up if a player was going to kick a serve out wide onto my backhand because he'd arch his back a little bit more, or his ball toss would go slightly further behind him. And from that, it wasn't until he'd actually hit the shot that I'd be able to know exactly what was going to happen. But I'd just be able to read it and anticipate it. So I might start to edge out that way a little bit just to prepare myself. Now, I might get it wrong and he might fool me and still go the other way. And that sometimes happens, which is why sometimes in tennis you see shot that doesn't look particularly hard, but it just beats the other player because they've anticipated it wrong. And this information can be learned prior. It can be done during the game, like you pick up that experience during the game, but it can also be done prior to the game. So an elite level, you know, for instance, goalkeepers studying the penalty technique of someone that's going to take the penalty kicks. And then they're able to anticipate it because they're just picking up on the cues. They might have watched an hour of videos of a guy taking a penalty. And whilst there might be a little bit of variety, they can start to pick up on those little idiosyncrasies and little bits of the technique that, I don't know, if they open their body up a little bit more, if they skip slightly more to one way, or they approach the ball a little bit quicker, that might then lead them to thinking they just get that split-second advantage of anticipating the movement. So I've run through a few examples there, but can you just make a list of when anticipation might be used in sport? Try and think of different sports. Again, invasion games, racket sports, bat and ball games, but even things like combat events like boxing, things like that. When might anticipation be used in sport? Just make a few notes. And to continue, there are two types of anticipation. So you just need to be aware of this because this is what essentially makes up successful anticipation. So the first one is called temporal anticipation, and this is just prejudging when the stimulus is going to happen. Okay, when. Added to that, you've got spatial anticipation. So what's going to happen and where is it going to happen? So if you know both of them plus that, so if you know this and this, that's going to lead to potentially a successful process of anticipating something in sport. If you picture it, if you only knew one of those things, if you knew when something was going to happen, but you didn't know exactly where it was going to happen, that wouldn't be very good. If you knew where it was going to happen, but you didn't know when. So if I was boxing and I knew someone was going to punch me in the face, but I just didn't know when it was going to happen, that's not great. So generally it requires both. So for instance, a rugby player's catching a high ball, they need to know where it's going to land, but they also need to know when it's going to get there. So it's no good just kind of waiting in that area. They need to get there at the right time. So can you think of any other examples? I mean, your examples that you've given before will all probably apply, but can you just be clear now in terms of the examples that you've given, the temporal anticipation of when and the spatial anticipation of where and potentially what? Just work those. You don't have to do them for all, but just for a couple of the examples previously listed, add in the details of temporal anticipation and spatial anticipation, like this one for the rugby. So make sure you've got the rugby one down, make it clear, whether you do it in different colored pen or just say this aspect of it is temporal, this aspect of it is spatial. Just add that in before you move on. Okay, now correct anticipation obviously is going to improve your response time because essentially your reactions are going to improve. So if the information processing is speeded up, it allows the movement aspect to happen immediately. So essentially, if the reaction time is that much quicker, you're then able to get to the movement time a lot quicker. If you get to the movement time a lot quicker, then produce the movement, the overall response time is going to be quicker. There's no delay. If the reaction time was slower, kind of eats into the time that you've got to actually respond. So the person that you're playing in tennis has hit their serve, you've only got, I don't know, half a second to work with. If that reaction time is going to take, 0.4 of that second, you've only got 0.1 second to actually make the movement. But if you've anticipated it and it only takes you 0.2 seconds to react, then you've got 0.3 seconds to produce the movement. So improving the reaction time through anticipation is going to allow a smoother process and ultimately a quicker response time. However, if the anticipation is wrong, then the stimulus that's presented is not the one that's expected and the response time will increase. So if you get it wrong, if you think it's going to your right, to your forehand in tennis, and it ends up going to the left, that's going to cause a delay because you've essentially invited an additional stimulus in there, and before you can get to the correct one, this idea of the, let's just work it back, psychological refractory period. So if you've prejudged it and anticipated that it's going to go one way, but it then actually goes the other way, you've added this one in, and you have to process that first one before you can then get to the second one. Okay, so generally it's a good thing, but if you get it wrong, it can delay everything, and that's why more often than not, if you've anticipated it wrong, you've gone one way and it ends up going the other way, you're probably not going to produce a very good response because everything's rushed. So can you give some sporting examples where anticipation might go wrong, and what's the likely outcome of that initial anticipation not working in your favor? Just work through one or two examples there. Pause the video, just think carefully. When might you anticipate something? What might be, where might that then go wrong? And what would be the outcome in the sporting context? Okay, pause it there and just complete that for one or two examples. Okay, last little bit. So factors affecting response time. So there's various different things that we've already talked about. So we're just going to want a nice concise list, because this might be a question where you just have to either identify them or potentially explain them. So if you had to just identify it, you might just say one of them being the number of choices. The number of choices is something that is going to affect response time. And when you're asked to explain something, you need to say why. You need to give a reason. This is because, and then just briefly outline what the reason is. So the number of choices would affect response time. This is because simple reaction time is much quicker than choice reaction time as per Hicks' law. More choices, slower reaction time. So that's an example of identifying it and then just very briefly explaining it. So things like, this is because. Yeah. So what I want you to do is try and think of other factors. It might be things that we've already mentioned in the presentation. So you just track back through each of the key things. What other things have we mentioned that might influence the reaction time or the response time? As I said, the two are kind of interchangeable because one influences the other one. And briefly outline how that response time might be affected. So explain it, identify it, and then just give a brief outline explaining it. Pause the video here, see what you can come up with. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few different potential factors for each one of these. I want you to think about what would be the explanation element. You might have already got these, in which case just tick them off. But let's just go through. So the number of choices, the psychological refractory period, previous experience, type of stimuli, the intensity of the stimuli, gender, age, fatigue, drug use, and level of arousal. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, counting 10. So let's just try and work through those. A very brief statement afterwards, just detailing how each of those factors affects response time. So pause the video here and try and work through as many of those as you can. And we'll just go through them. So the number of choices, as I said, Hicks' law, simple reaction time is quicker than choice reaction time. More choices is a slower response. The psychological refractory period, so that deception slows the response down, whether it's a net cord that's essentially a kind of an unintentional deception. You know, you generally don't intend to hit the net cord, but it could equally be something like a fake or a throw in a dummy and a little shimmy, just pretending to go one way and then dropping the shoulder and going the other way. That causes a psychological refractory period. You've thrown in an additional response. The opponent will think you're going one way and prepare for that, and then you throw in the additional response before they can process that. They've got to deal with the first one, which is why, you know, basketball players get their ankles broken because they think they're going one way, and then suddenly the guy does a crossover and goes the other way, and they're totally off balance. They can't process it quickly enough to adjust properly. That deception slows the response down. Previous experience, so this is linked into this anticipation idea that we were looking at. So generally it's based on that experience that results in quicker response. If you've got experience of something, whether that's within a game that's been going on a long time, or you're a more elite athlete and you've prepared for it, studied videos, for instance, of opponents taking goal kicks, that previous experience will lead to a quicker reaction time or a quicker response time. Part of the reason for that is they're able to anticipate, they can pick up those cues. So those little signals or shapes from the body, whatever it might be, but you can pick it up, and you're better at doing that if you're more experienced. The type of stimuli, so the sound, for instance, tends to lead to a quicker response rather than just visually. If you can hear something, it tends to mean that you're more likely to have a quicker response. The intensity of it, so it's likely that there's a more intense the stimuli, the quicker the reaction is going to be. So if you get a quiet call from the side to mark up in football, that probably is going to lead to a slow response. If your coach is absolutely, going steam coming out the ears, belting it at you that you need to pick up someone at the back post, you're more likely to then do it. So it's essentially the volume of the instructions that you might be hearing, but it also might just be something visual, like the color. So bright colors tends to be a more intense stimuli. The more intense the stimuli, the quicker the response. Gender, so males tend to have a quicker response time. This is very much a generalization. If you go on the basic idea that males are bigger with more muscle mass is going to lead to greater power and speed of movement. Now this is slightly different element of this, because in this one you're more looking at the movement time. So actual time it takes to complete the movement. So once you've picked up the stimulus, so from the pushing off of the blocks to the actual finish of the race, if you're more powerful, you're more likely to be able to do that quicker. And if you can do the movement time quicker, then the overall response time is going to be quicker as well, because response time takes into account reaction time plus movement time. So if you've got a good reaction time, that's good. But if you've got a good movement time, that's also going to lead to an overall reduction in response time or an improved response. Age, so generally, as you get older, response time is going to decrease generally. Fatigue, so if you're fatigued, so extreme tiredness, maybe later in the game, or things like a lack of fluids, that's going to lead to a slower response. Things like drug use, while it's not legal, the intended benefit is that things like steroids and stimulants will potentially reduce your response time. So you're actually going to react quicker because you've taken on board these performance enhancing drugs. And finally, although potentially linked into this one, not always, but potentially, level of arousal. So that's a topic that GCSE students will be familiar with. So I mentioned it before. Got this inverted U for all sports. This is arousal. This is the level of performance. As arousal increases, quality of performance will go up. That's this bit, up until the optimal point of arousal, which is the perfect point you want it to be for any individual skill. After that, as arousal continues to increase, performance level starts to come down. We'll look at that in a lot more detail, but generally in terms of affecting response time, optimal arousal provides the quickest response. If you're over aroused, you're going to be too hyped, too pumped up. You're not going to be able to focus, and you're going to make errors in your technique because you're not focused and concentrating. That's going to lead to a poor response. But equally, if you're dozy and not focused enough, then that's going to lead to a poor response time as well, because you're not concentrating on the specific, you're not like tuned into the exact cues that you should be. So a range of different factors. Just work your way through them. Make sure you've got them each noted down. You don't necessarily have to remember them all, but certainly a range of them would be good. Whether you can come up with some sort of anagram or something like that, you know, looking at key letters or spelling out a particular word, maybe take a minute just to have a play around with that. Some of them are more obvious than others. Factors affecting response time. And finally, improving response time. So have a think. Now we know what the factors are that can affect it. How can you actually improve it? So these are a couple of questions that just might stir the pot a little bit. What sort of practice might help improve reaction time? So I think when we looked at types of practice, what sort of practice might help improve reaction time, bearing in mind it's a psychological process. Certainly part of it is a psychological process. So what sort of practice could be done that's going to improve, you know, that aspect of your performance? And what sort of training might be used to improve movement time? So when you're looking at the second element of it, I think you've got the reaction time as the first part, and then movement time as the second part. Consider kind of the fitness components that are important. We mentioned it on the previous slide. A couple of key fitness components that were important in terms of improving movement time. And from them, what sort of training can be done to improve those fitness components? Take a minute to work through that, see if you can think of anything else, and then we'll just pick it up and I'll run through the last few. Okay, let's just whistle through this. So the first one's, like I said, type of practice, so mental practice. So it's quite a lot of information here. You don't have to note it all down, but just be clear about how mental practice is potentially going to help. So I've just outlined it in full with a little example. So going over the task in the mind prior to the action, that's what mental practice is. You're processing it before you actually go and participate in the event. This improves response participation time, so the action can be predicted and made quicker. So if you've processed it a little bit already, you're not then having to think it through in as much depth at the time of when you actually need to produce it. This is particularly good for closed skills. So think about what a closed skill is, but also serial skills. So for instance, a trampolining routine. So that's a serial skill, series of discrete skills put together in a closed skill. What's a closed skill? One where it's a stable environment, so it's not affected by lots of other things in the environment. If you've got that, a trampoline routine is a good example of that. Okay, so it's closed because it's not affected by external environment, so it's a stable environment, and it's a series of skills, serial skill, series of discrete skills. And if you can think about your routine, if you've got a 10 bounce routine, before you do it, you go through the process of that routine in your head over and over and over. You're not then having to think it through. And if you were, you're more likely to make a mistake because you're thinking, right, what comes next, rather than just concentrating on the quality of the movement. So mental practice is definitely one that would help response time. The other one, one of the ones that wasn't mentioned, was just training to a specific stimulus. So for instance, a goalkeeper practicing saving penalties to the left. So it might be that they end up doing both ways, but if they're preparing for a particular game and they know that the penalty taker is likely, or more often than not, goes to the left. If a goalkeeper practices that, then when it comes to the actual event, they're more likely to be able to respond quicker because they'll have picked up on those cues that are coming their way, and they can produce a quicker reaction time, probably a better movement time as well, and then ultimately a reduced response time. The one that we had mentioned before was to do with fitness, so training using interval training. So interval training generally focus on speed and power. Plyometric training is all about power, and we'll look at these two different training methods later in the course. Training that increases these two fitness components. So and during the movement part, so it's going to improve movement time, and if you improve movement time, you're going to improve or reduce response time. Using anticipation, so works best if you're an experienced performer. This works best then, so an elite level works best if you're prepared, having done prior research. So at an elite level, it's the sort of thing that you would probably do, whether it's in tennis, cricket, football, boxing, whatever it is. You use that anticipation to improve your response time. And finally, you just learn to focus and concentrate better. So if your coach can provide stimulus, which is going to be more intense, like color of the bibs, color of the ball. So a goalkeeper might train using a really bright colored ball, which means that they're kind of going to fade out other things and just going to concentrate on the ball. When it comes to a game, they're going to be so zoned in on the ball that their focus will be that much better, and then potentially response time is going to improve as a result. Could even just be things like a gymnastics coach highlighting. They might, if they're on a beam, so say if you were looking down on the beam from above, they might just put a cross or something or mark it there. And if then the gymnast, when they're doing their routine, they can focus on that. That's just going to give them a point to zone in on during their performance. That's where I need to land towards the end before I complete my dismount. So it highlights it, it makes it more intense, and that's going to improve the response time because they're not thinking it through so much. It becomes natural and subconscious. Okay, so let's just rattle through this in terms of everything that hopefully we've now covered and you're able to produce good notes on and understand each of these things. So the definition of the three terms, sport and examples of each one of those, definitions of simple and choice reaction time, and sporting examples of those. Can you use sporting examples to explain Hicks' law? Can you use sporting examples to explain single channel hypotheses? Can you use sporting examples to explain psychological refractory period? Can you explain anticipation in sport, including the two key elements for the process to be effective? Can you outline different factors which influence response time? Can you outline how response time can be improved? So we've looked at each of those things, huge amount of content. It may be that you've taken a couple of lessons to go through this, but hopefully you've got good notes. Hopefully, as you work through this in due course for your revision, these things will be nice and clear for you. If you have any questions, please note them down and then just let me know. Otherwise, I'm looking forward to seeing your work with all of your examples complete for this. Okay, guys, take it easy and bye-bye.